Okay, right, well, thank you so much to all of you who've come this morning, 9:30 on a Friday morning. I know it's not the best time in a long conference, so we really appreciate it, but I think you will find that it's worth it. I'm Merryn, Somerset Webb, Editor-in-Chief of MoneyWeek and an FT columnist. I suspect I have quite a lot of readers in the audience, so I will just say I will be staying around at the end for a few minutes so you can direct your complaints about how I have defamed either your industry or your company directly to me, but we'll talk about that later. Now, I also want to welcome our online audience. This is being live streamed, so if you're watching online, welcome. And also feel free to ask questions online. You'll see there's a link. You can click right through and ask us a question. If you're in the audience here, you can ask a question directly at the end, and I think you can also come to us via an iPad. Now, I don't want to waste any more time on admin, so straight on to our brilliant guest, Elizabeth Linder. Now, Elizabeth is the kind of person I think most of us haven't really met before. She's worked for pretty much every big company in Silicon Valley that you either love or love to hate. So she started at YouTube, moved to Google, or rather was at YouTube when it was taken over by Google, and then moved on to Facebook, where she's been incredibly influential in setting up the politics division, which helped with the interaction between social media, business, politics. How does it all work? What's it all about? And now she has her own consultancy called the Conversational Century, which is about improving the conversation between the public, business, and political leaders. And I think this is what we're going to hear about, particularly today, how leadership has changed from being a one-directional thing to being a multi-directional thing. And that has changed our politics and our business and will continue to do so for a long time to come. She's also Senior Consulting Fellow at Chatham House, where she heads the think tank's Connectivity Initiative and advises on the future of foreign policy in a connected world, which sounds mildly terrifying. So I'm going to hand straight over to Elizabeth, and we will have questions when she's finished. Thank you.
Great. Well, thank you so much. And thank you so much for having me here this morning. The timing, actually, of this is brilliant, because just last week, I was taking the director of Chatham House out to my old stomping ground in the San Francisco Bay Area and the Silicon Valley to meet all of the movers and shakers in the space of big tech, but also all of the entrepreneurs out there. And at the end of one of the meetings, one of the guys we were talking to said, "All right, now, Elizabeth, here's what we got to do. We got to just keep running, Elizabeth. We got to just keep running. We got to change the world." And I thought, living in London, I don't hear enough of that. And you hear that literally every day in California. You just keep running and change the world. That's how these guys tick, that's how they roll, that's how they think. And it's worth bearing that in mind as we have this conversation, because that is, that's where all of this begins, the space of digital society and digital leadership. All of these incredible products that come out of California and impact the world, but then the world starts to use the products and impact back into the space. So as I was thinking about today, there are four societal trends that I thought I would take a dive into to set the scene. And then we'll have some time to engage in conversation and question and answer. But the first, I would say, is probably, for me, the most important space to wrap our head around. And that is the huge breakdown between cultures. Between the tech sector and the way that it works, and pretty much, I would say, any other business, any other sector. And that's the distinction between hacker culture and production culture. Production culture is what we're generally speaking used to operating in. It's our 20th century rendering of how it is that we go about our businesses. We create something, we display that to the world, and the world uses what it is that we create in the way that we intend it to be used. Hacker culture, the culture of the technology sector, the culture of digital society, the culture of the Silicon Valley, works exactly the opposite way. You create a product, you look at how people misuse that product in order to inform how you should build the product moving forward. So in the early days of Facebook, I spent 8 years at Facebook from 2008 to 2016. And in the early days, there was one space for a picture, a photo on the Facebook platform. That was the spot that was reserved for your profile picture. And what the engineers started to notice was rather strange behavior in that slot for the profile picture. People started to change it all the time. They would come back from a holiday and they would change their profile picture. They'd have a great meal at a restaurant and they'd change the profile picture. And the engineers sat there and thought, well, this isn't at all how we intended this space to be used. Your profile picture is meant to be one stable photo that represents you over the long term. But of course, that was the spark to say, well, gosh, if people are actually using this space to change photographs all the time, maybe they actually want to use Facebook to share photos. And of course, fast forward, and now Facebook is the #1 photo sharing app in the world. But it's the ability and the mindset of thinking about how it is that people misuse the service you've built, to hack into how it is that they want to use the service that you've built, that drives innovation in the Silicon Valley. When I was working with the Moldovans a few years ago in their e-government team, I was asked to deliver a public talk in Chisinau, the capital city of Moldova. And a young man who attended this public forum at the end of my talk said, you know, Elizabeth, when you go back to California, can you ask Mark Zuckerberg if he would consider printing marriage licenses for us? And I looked at this kid and I thought, where the heck is this conversation going? But what he said is, you know, here in Moldova, the process of actually getting a marriage certificate is extremely laborious and corrupt. We have to wait in these long lines that most of us, you know, young people with jobs don't have time to do. We have to pay off loads of government officials in order to get the license done. But he said, look, you know, if we could just change our relationship status from in a relationship to engaged, then Mark Zuckerberg out in California can just print the certificate, send it to us in Moldova, and it's just done. You know, and for a moment there, actually, I kind of forgot my, you know, I'm actually representing Facebook right now. I was listening to him saying, actually, that's a really good idea. And I thought, whoa, no, Facebook would never do that. But the point is, you know, people in today's world are starting to approach not just their lives, but their businesses with hacker mentality. You know, whatever doesn't work, you now have the tools and the resources available to just fix it yourself. Figure out how it is that you actually want to use the products and services that are given to you, and insist that that's the way that they're used. This whole space I find absolutely fascinating because it comes so naturally to the Silicon Valley environment, to the tech sector environment. And yet most industries are still struggling to wrap their head around what their role in a global hacker culture, hacker environment looks like. What does it actually look like for all of you to make it up, frankly, as you go along? This is not the way that we're trained to think about our businesses, but it's the way that we need to start to move in order to keep up with the expectations of customers around the world. The second societal theme that I wanted to press on for us a little bit this morning is the tension, or maybe the relationship between the rise of the amateurs and where that fits in to the role of the expert. This is something that, of course, is being discussed quite a bit right now in the world of politics. But it's also extremely important in the private sector and in the role of business, and indeed the world of finance as well. Your world is filled with people who are not experts in your field, but who are amateurs in the field, who have now a voice to actually give advice to people, to talk to people. And it's the businesses that actually understand that in today's world, a huge part of what you need to do to succeed is figure out how to curate the rising voices, the rising tide of the amateurs. Businesses that figure out how to actually integrate amateur voices into what it is that you're trying to do are going to succeed in a digitally connected environment. Because you can't ignore the existence of millions of people who are connecting to each other, giving each other free advice. But what you can do is help move those people into a direction that's productive and useful for what you're trying to do. A sector here in the UK that I have great respect for in how it is that they've adapted to 21st century digital culture and environment is the world of policing. Police forces in the UK had to very quickly get up to speed with what it is that the digital revolution was doing to the way they thought about their work. And the pinnacle moment of this really was the London riots. Do you remember in 2011, this kind of spontaneous rioting in London, which caused a huge question amongst politicians? What do we do? Everybody's using all of these new services to communicate with each other, and we're not really used to this in this kind of town or city or environment. And as a result of that event, I was invited by the police to actually go in and to the Home Office, and we had representatives from every county across the UK to do a deep dive into how it is that they needed to reframe their work in a digital era. And in fact, one county here, the Staffordshire Police, did such a good job of that, that they recently found that more people today trust updates from the Staffordshire Police on Facebook than they trust updates about the Staffordshire Police in print, radio, and TV news. Even further, more people trust those updates from the police on Facebook than they trust a phone call to the police itself. And largely that's because they've done such a good job, A, of building over the long term a trusted, ongoing dialogue with the people that their police force covers. But B, and I think even more interestingly, they've reframed their curation of, quote, amateurs by harnessing people's natural willingness to volunteer as part of keeping communities safe. So they've taken everybody connected to the online world, which, in a country like this, obviously, is more than 50% of the population across all ages and demographics. And when somebody, goes missing, for example, the police will put a photo up online on platforms like Facebook. They'll ask people to share the postcode where they've seen that photo to ensure that it's being shared around. When that individual is found, they'll remove the photo, often include a thank you note to people from friends and family of that missing person. What essentially the police force is doing in that situation is acknowledging the fact that we are safer when we enlist everybody in our communities to help do the job, which is the official job of the police. So technically, of course, it's the policeman's job to go out and find these missing people. But they've realized, hold on, in today's environment, it makes so much more sense to get everybody else out there working with us to help us succeed in our mission, to be our ambassadors for us, to be our spokespeople for us, to help us do our job better. Something that bothers me a lot in the work that I do, training and working with leaders on digital society at the corporate or at the political level, is we see such a lack still of bravery in our own selves and our own ability to work, that people don't actually take advantage of the ability to look outward and say, my gosh, there are millions of creative people we can draw from, of people who analyze, the markets just for fun because it's interesting, even if that's not what they do as part of their day job. All of those people out there are actually ripe to help inform our businesses, to spice things up, to bring in fresh ideas. You know, once we've done a job for a while, we sit around a conference room thinking, well, what's a new idea we can bring into the mix? We actually can now ask that question to our, the people that are connected to us online. Some, kid in Kenya can come up with a great idea that we think, wow, I never would have thought of that, thanks. So why don't we do that? A few sectors do, and that's why I do have so much respect for policing in this country. They've really figured that out. Rather than hold on to their power, they're opening up their power and saying, look, it's not a problem that you guys are all out there learning about this field or willing to help us. It's actually useful to figure out where we need to go. But being proactive in curating those voices is the forefront of this space. Journalists are doing this incredibly well. Turning to the digital world, turning online to say, look, I'm writing a story on XYZ topic. Who out there has experience with this? What can we learn from each other? There are so many ways to bring in the global expertise of amateurs, the global expertise of volunteers, into our official professional missions that I think we can make really, really, really great use of over time. Third, and this one actually I think about a lot because of my background at the big tech companies, is this relationship between standardization and scale versus personalization and localization. So the reason why, in huge part, the tech sector, the tech industry has been so powerful and such a game changer on the global stage is thanks to their ruthless understanding of scale. Everything about the Silicon Valley is, how do you scale this? How do you scale this? How do you scale this? And certainly in the early days of Facebook, that was the biggest question. It was all about growth at the time that I joined the company, and still, frankly, today there are so many more countries that the company is looking to grow into, thanks to their satellites and their drones. But with that scale kicks in the network effect. That means there are enough people connected to these platforms that you can actually start to go local again. You can actually start to create a more personalized experience because you have enough data to do that really, really, really well. So examples of this from the tech sector, would be, well, the obvious one from my former employer, the newsfeed. The Facebook newsfeed works so well because it is highly personalized to each individual. And this has come under some criticism, obviously, recently, as people raise questions about filter bubbles and whether or not it's right or good, the fact that each individual user using the platform has a different experience. But to be honest, when the company has tested ways for people to see all of the content available to them, rather than just the content that the company suspects they'll find interesting, usage goes down. 21st century consumers are really accustomed to a more bespoke, a more personal service coming in to them. And we know, based on the numbers and the data, that that experience works. The same is going on in the healthcare space today, and in the biotech sector. Again, just last week, a conversation with one of the biotech firms out in California. Everything about that sector is turning into a highly, highly personalized approach to each individual, because the more you're actually able to use data, big data, to understand what's going on in an individual, the less you have a kind of one-size-fits-all approach and an extremely personalized approach to the individual. Even in the food and restaurant scene, You have Michelin star restaurants that are Googling you in advance to see what kind of preference you tend to have on your experience in a restaurant. Call you up and say, these are the ingredients that are available. Our chef can put together whatever menu it is that you like. You check into a hotel and you get your pillow menu and you select which one you're looking for. All of these experiences play in to a highly tailored approach to an individual. And certainly in the space of finance and FinTech, this is exactly the kind of trend that we're seeing. Less of an approach that actually says, okay, with scale comes, one package for everybody, and more, all right, what is the precise package that works for you, which we know will work for you because we have network numbers that are big enough to understand exactly what kind of customer you're going to be. And it's actually, I would say, kind of exciting, because what it almost does is bring us back to some of the best of the small town, know your neighbor approach to business and to life, but combined with a modern drawing from the global connected world to get there. Opening up so many more opportunities, but in a highly personalized and highly individual way. As you can see, I'm generally speaking an optimist about where it is that technology is taking us. I can't help it. It's in my DNA. Finally, and I think this is probably the area that I'm perhaps think we have the longest to go to actually sort out, is the relationship in the 21st century digital environment between speed and space. Most business leaders, most government officials, politicians, diplomats that I have worked with around the world tend to frame everything about digital society in terms of speed. We have to make decisions faster because people expect a response faster. How many people do we need to get on our team to figure out what kind of social media strategy we need? It's about numbers, and those numbers are big because the technology space is big. And then it's super, super fast because, oh my gosh, WhatsApp is really fast. I think that's a huge mistake. It's following the tech sector down its own rabbit hole. It's the tech company's job, it's the digital company's job to sort out the speed question. It's your job to sort out the usage of the space that these products and services online give you. And I mean that in a number of different ways. The first hire I made at Facebook was a data scientist. And when we crunched the numbers from heads of state and politicians at the national level using Facebook, we actually found that the longer the post, the better it would perform. Because an individual leader that would actually use the space that was given to them to have conversations with people, to explain why it is that they're voting in a certain way, or to explain what is going on in their head when they're making a decision, that kind of content goes down much better than using these services as a headline, as an adjunct to the kinds of articles that you read about in the press. You don't want to follow somebody online just to read about what you would see in the newspapers. You want to get inside their head. That's the whole point. That's the point of primary source conversations, which any journalist will tell you, no matter what it is that you're writing about now, you need to actually link over to the original press conference from which you derived your opinion, or the original report that you read that informed your analysis. In today's world, people actually want to see the primary piece of content, more so sometimes than the secondary piece of content. But the amazing thing is that you actually have the space to do that, because in the digital world, space is an unlimited quantity. It's really quite popular right now to describe data as the new oil. That just doesn't even make sense. You know, a natural sort of product, or a product that comes from our earth, isn't necessarily replenishing at a constant rate. Data is constantly changing and constantly replenishing. But the space that you can use to actually transform conversations that you're having with your customers, or to, you know, open up what it is that you're doing with the kinds of work that you're doing with people, these are all conversations that you can have at an unlimited scale and in as much detail as you need. And I think that's really exciting because it changes the relationship between the person who is in the leadership, in the responsible role, and the person who's affected by that leadership role. You can have these kinds of two-way conversations without needing to necessarily reach them via a very limited, you know, podcast or nightly news episode, or you know, brochure write-up that is expensive to print. So speed and space is something that I really hope that business leaders, political leaders start to wrap their head around. Because it's hugely unhealthy and unproductive for our societies to frame everything in terms of the faster is better approach. Slow social media, slow digital society actually does work better in many cases for people to wrap their head around what's going on in this space. So that being said, I'm now going to head back to the bench, and we have some time for questions.
Brilliant. See, I told you it'd be worth getting up early to listen to this. Thank you, Elizabeth. Absolutely fascinating. Now we're going to open to questions in a tick, but before we do, and quite a lot of comment on the iPad as well, thank you everybody. But before we do, I just want to ask you about one thing that you mentioned. You talked about the police, and you talked about trust and the way that social media can help build trust in this particular case. But one of the things that we've seen a lot over the last few years is the idea that social media actually reduces trust, and we've seen that in governments, etc. And governments have made a lot of effort in the areas of the police and other areas to communicate directly, and we've seen this, of course, in all the referendums that I know you've been helpful during, the way that governments and groups, parties have used social media to interact with people. Very interesting new trend. But one area where we haven't really seen this happen so much, and where there is a huge lack of trust, the relationship between the man on the street and big business. And we've seen trust in CEOs and top managers falling and falling and falling and falling. What we haven't seen is big companies, big corporates coming to social media and attempting to have the same kind of direct conversation with their end users, their clients, and even their shareholders, as we've seen in the public space. Now, how do you see that changing? Should it change? Yeah. Should big business be trying to interact in a different way?
Yeah, I mean, it's such a great question. I think, well, I have my background in the communications, you know, PR side of business. That's how I started it at Google. And I actually think that that whole field right now needs to break down. Because what we tend to do with our business leaders is we train them out of having real natural conversations with people, because they get so accustomed to thinking of every conversation they have in terms of the message, the PR message they're trying to land, or the headline that they need to get when it's written up in the press. So what that does is actually create, I think, a huge vacuum in the online space, because that kind of approach just doesn't work in 21st century communications. And actually, so much of effective trust building and communications on social media is much more about talking about what you don't necessarily know, talking about what you're still trying to work out or figure out. You need to have that kind of honesty in discussion, which takes an extremely brave individual to do, and something that your PR team is going to hate, because this is not at all the way that the industry has been built.
Well, and it bypasses them.
Yeah, exactly. So my favorite way to kind of frame this is these kinds of conversations is the dinner party discussion. You know, when you go to a dinner party, you're not in the mode that you are just at home with your family. It's not like, you know, everything is just relaxed. But you're also not in a professional, I'm now sitting down on nightly news with a journalist mode. You know, you're in that kind of in-between space having a discussion. That's the ideal mode to be in to build trust with people online and in social media. And it's really sad to me how few businesses do this. You know, I just think corporate leaders have really struggled with this space because they haven't quite wrapped their head around where it is that their voice fits in with the global tide of amateurs. And if they're not there, we have no role models, you know, to help us see our way through.
Yeah, and this is something that is very relevant to this industry, to the fund management industry. Again, is this direct communication with the client in a world of middlemen, of IFAs, of platforms, etc. Again, it's hard for the fund management industry to get its voice direct to its end user. And again, possibly they could pick it up better.
Yeah, exactly. Well, and that's what people expect. You know, it goes back to the, you know, what is the initial primary source piece of information that they need to understand from their content. But you know, even in the police world that I mentioned, you know, I think so often with our businesses, if you're looking to reach the right kinds of customers, you often think you have to spend a lot to find them. You know, on social media, if your niche, you know, customer base that you're looking for, you know, is reachable on social media, often the spend that you have to do to find them is really cheap. Yeah. And that's why police forces have been able to use this so well, because if they're looking for a specific community that is marginalized, you know, that doesn't really realize that they can rely on the police to help, the police can spend 25p, you know, to run a quick ad to reach them. This is not an expensive game to play to reach the right kinds of customers you're looking for.
Brilliant. Right, now I think we have roving mics. So are there any questions from the audience? Well, one right here. Thank you.
Morning, Elizabeth. Thank you for that really engaging presentation. The world of the amateur, the world of the engaging amateur, the world of the non-engaging amateur who tweets the whole time, your president. Is this the result of the world we're in?
So, you know, the question about our current president is one that I find really frustrating in a way, because, you know, I spent so many years working with politicians at a senior level trying to convey the message that they had to actually get in this space, but not just to get elected, but to speak directly to people and to just be honest in representing their own selves with those people. You know, not that carefully polished soundbite that has, you know, ruined so much of politics. And what's so frustrating is the first person in a really big way to come along and do that was Donald Trump. It didn't have to be that way. It didn't have to be that when everybody thinks of you know, the politician who's using Twitter, that it has to be in some way done by an individual who doesn't value eloquence or elegance in thought or discourse. There's no reason that you know, he needed to be the first to do it. He just was, because nobody else was brave enough. You know, President Obama used, and his team used Facebook to get elected, but not actually to engage in dialogue, you know, with people. That was a huge missed opportunity, I think, in America, and certainly a missed opportunity everywhere else as well. So I find it actually, the silver lining in all of this is that, you know, I saw this pretty much immediately after Trump got elected, because he was making so much use of social media as that primary source way to reach people directly. All of the politicians swirling around him, and, you know, many of those people who disagreed with him, were actually forced as well to start speaking more directly and more frankly and more openly to people. So the one advantage that I can see long term is that it, you know, something aside from, you know, companies trying to tell our leaders to wake up to this space, something had to be that catalyst. And I think long term we're going to look back and say, okay, it was the Trump moment that was the catalyst, the wake up call for global leaders to say, you guys have to get in the game. But you can't get in the game with trite sound bites. You have to get in it with honest conversation with people. And I think long term that's going to be a good thing. I hope it's going to be a good thing.
There you go, you heard it here first. President Trump is a force for good, catalyst for good change. One more here, thank you.
Sarah Chance Arkney. Thank you very much. Can I follow on that? Because you've talked a lot about primary source. With President Trump, maybe it's obvious, but how do we actually know it's the primary source talking? I mean, in the view of fake news, but also, yeah, it's great people have the Twitter account, but how do I know it's not a ghostwriter? I'm cynical about this. How do I know it's, not... Fraud, by its definition, is hard to detect.
Yeah.
So somebody who wants to do it well...
Yeah.
I'm just a bit concerned.
So my favorite, one of my favorite areas, and I guess this kind of comes back to the policing in a way, is to see this play out is emergency response. So take, for example, you may have read about the big fires in California, in the Napa Valley, where my parents live. So, sitting in London, we were getting very little news about this at a detailed, granular level. The BBC was covering it in terms of, here's how many acres are being affected. But what I needed to know is whether or not my parents were going to be evacuated. I needed to know the real details. And so, of course, in turning online, you would actually see, every hour on the hour, the head of the fire department, the head of the police commission from all of the little counties around the area doing their briefings, the person who's responsible for coordinating the efforts with the National Guard, going up and saying, all right, here's what we know, here's what we don't know. That's primary source in action at its absolute best. Because that's me, sitting in a flat in London, hearing straight from the guys that are briefing the press on what it is that needs to go out. So of course, any individual journalist can report on what they think is most important to understand. But as the audience member, I can also just sit there and just watch directly what they're hearing first. And that space is really, really, really powerful because it actually cuts away from just hearing from the people at the top, to hearing everybody along the way that has an impact in a decision. So it's all very well and good that your CEO, says something, but often what you really need to know is the kind of middle person who is the expert informing the CEO on a specific area of your business. Now they have a voice too. And if a business approaches this well, I actually think that rather than a problem, that is helpful for most people to gain maximum insight into what's going on. But again, our leaders are so accustomed to who gets a voice and who doesn't have a voice in business that we need to completely hack our whole mentality around that space and rethink how it is that we open up the dialogue so that primary source content can actually be productive and not hurtful in our societies.
Yeah, thank you. We've got a lot of questions coming through on the iPad, and a lot of them are along the same kind of vein, which is about the next big thing in the future. So, will there be a Facebook bank? Will there be a Facebook mobile phone, etc.? But summed up, basically, what is the next big digital development, do you think, that could change the way that we work and the way that we live?
Yeah, well, it's probably a little bit maybe trite to say, but I just think, I think we've only seen the beginning of the sharing economy at play. Where people actually are, can trade, goods, services, how they spend their free time in this amateur way with each other. And something that I found really interesting in, that's going on out in the Silicon Valley right now are all of these neighborhood, apps. That are helping people, you're making a cake and you need an extra egg. Well, the person next door, has one, so you don't need to go to the grocery store. Or, you're looking for a parking spot and people are alerting each other to where there's one available. All of this ability to actually share at a really, really, really granular level without necessarily a payment in a way that we understand the rules of payment to be used is, I think, fascinating. The other space, though, that I think is really interesting is the way that technology is helping us to fight corruption. in a number of, of countries where we actually see this at play. So, Uber often gets a really bad rap. I've never worked at Uber, so I haven't been one of their spokespeople, but, what we need to think about in light of what it is that their business is doing is, equally to disrupting the London taxi environment, which some think is good and some think is terrible. You're also having environments where getting in any kind of, car service is hugely corrupt, and they're charging whatever they want. You don't have an ability to hoodwink your customer in the same way when everything is taking place on your phone. And so I think in a lot of emerging markets, what's really, for me, exciting about meeting with civil society leaders is the force for good that a globally scaled technology can bring into their local communities has huge potential to change the world.
Fantastic. Now we're getting very close to the end, I'm afraid. In fact, we may even have passed the end. So I'm just going to ask you one quick question of my own before we end, which is, in this age of disseminated information, in this age of a conversation directly between leader and man in the street, what about the journalist?
What about the journalist?
What's our role in this new world?
Yeah, well, so interestingly, I mentioned long-form content, and I was talking about that in the context of politics. I don't know if some of you are familiar with Dan Rather, the journalist, retired journalist in America, but he has turned entirely to digital platforms to have discussions, to share his analysis on global events, and especially in American politics. Here is a guy who is of an age that nobody would just naturally think of as getting the digital revolution. And yet, he has successfully used these kinds of tools in exactly the way that they should be used, but in the way most people don't use them because they think, again, everything has to be so short and quick. So I think journalists succeeding online is absolutely a thing. I think it's just a matter of getting out there and realizing that you don't have to actually change and shorten what you have to say. You need to just really go for what you have to say, and the people do respond to that kind of content.
Okay, well, I'll try harder. Thank you.
Take heart.
I'm afraid we have to end it there. So it's just to say, Elizabeth, thank you so much for joining us. It's been absolutely brilliant. Now, before you start clapping, tiny bit of admin. Could you please rate the panel using the conference app? There's going to be a slide on the screen. Is it there now? Yes, telling you how to do it. So please do that. And the next session, just to tell you, it features Ian Blackford MP, the Westminster leader of the SNP, and he's going to be making a presentation before a panel discussion on Scotland's potential role as a European financial centre. Now, that would be good. Now we can clap. Elizabeth, thank you so much. Wonderful to have you.